He thought asking her to leave first class would be a simple correction. But in less than 10 minutes, that single decision would unravel everything he believed about power, status, and who truly belongs. The boarding gate at JFK buzzed with the low hum of early morning travelers, polished shoes clicking across marble floors, the scent of fresh coffee lingering in the air as priority passengers were called first. Evelyn Carter stepped forward without hesitation, her movements calm, almost invisible in a space filled with sharp suits and designer handbags. At 38, she carried herself with a quiet composure that didn't demand attention, but somehow held it anyway. Her gray sweater was simple, her jeans unbranded, her carry-on slightly worn at the edges, the kind of bag that told a story of use rather than display. As she handed over her boarding pass, the agent gave it a brief glance before forcing a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. First-class boarding is just starting. Ma'am, you may want to wait, she said. Her tone carefully neutral. Evelyn didn't argue. She simply turned the pass slightly, so the embossed lettering caught the light. Seat 2A. The agent blinked, hesitated, then scanned it quickly. A soft beep confirmed what she hadn't expected. Of course, right this way. The shift in tone was subtle, but noticeable. Evelyn nodded once and walked down the jet bridge, her footsteps quiet against the narrow corridor as the distant roar of the aircraft engines vibrated through the walls inside the cabin. First class stretched out in muted luxury, wide leather seats, soft lighting, and the gentle clink of glassware as flight attendants prepared for departure. Passengers settled in with practiced ease, adjusting watches, checking phones, exchanging brief nods of acknowledgement. Evelyn moved toward seat 2A without drawing attention, placing her bag carefully in the overhead compartment before sitting down, her hands resting lightly in her lap. For a moment, everything was still, but across the aisle, a flight attendant paused. Lydia Grant had been working this route for nearly a decade, and she prided herself on knowing exactly who belonged in first class and who didn't. It wasn't written anywhere, but she could tell by the details: the watch, the shoes, the posture, and something about Evelyn didn't fit. Lydia's gaze lingered a second too long, her eyes scanning the simple outfit, the unassuming demeanor. A flicker of doubt crossed her face, quickly replaced by a professional smile she had perfected over years of service. She approached slowly, each step measured. Good morning, ma'am, she said, her voice smooth but carrying just enough edge to draw attention. May I see your boarding pass again? Evelyn looked up, her expression calm, almost curious. Of course, she replied, handing it over without hesitation. Lydia took it, her fingers tightening slightly as she examined the seat number again. 2A. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she glanced around the cabin, aware of a few passengers beginning to watch. The silence shifted almost imperceptibly, like the air itself was waiting for something. Lydia leaned in, just slightly lowering her voice, but not enough to keep it private. I just want to make sure there hasn't been a mistake. These seats are reserved for our premium passengers. The words hung there, polite on the surface, but unmistakably pointed. Evelyn didn't react immediately. She simply met Lydia's gaze, steady and unshaken. There was no embarrassment in her eyes, no defensiveness, only a quiet patience that seemed to unsettle more than it reassured. I understand, she said softly. That's why I'm sitting here. Lydia's smile tightened, the kind that signaled control, slipping just enough to be noticed around them. A few passengers exchanged glances. One man paused mid-sip of his drink, another lowered his phone just slightly. The cabin, once filled with soft pre-flight noise, began to fall into a subtle hush. Lydia straightened, her posture sharpening as she handed the boarding pass back with deliberate care. I'm going to need you to step into the aisle for a moment, ma'am, she said, now her voice carried further, no longer trying to stay discreet. We'll need to verify your seating before departure. Evelyn looked at the boarding pass in her hand, then back at Lydia. Her fingers didn't tremble, her breathing didn't change. Slowly, she unfastened her seatbelt. The faint click echoed louder than it should have in that moment. No one spoke, no one moved. The entire first-class cabin seemed to lean into the tension, waiting to see what would happen next. And somewhere far above the runway, beyond the glass and steel of the terminal, the engines idled, unaware that before this plane ever left the ground, something far more powerful than turbulence was about to shake everything inside it. The sound of the seatbelt unfastening seemed to echo longer than it should have, stretching the silence across the cabin like a held breath that no one dared release. Evelyn Carter rose slowly from seat 2A, her movements controlled, unhurried. as if she were standing up in her own living room rather than under the watchful eyes of an entire first-class cabin. Her hand brushed lightly against the armrest as she stepped into the aisle, her posture straight, her expression unchanged. Lydia Grant took a half-step back, reclaiming her space with practiced authority, though something in her eyes flickered just briefly. A hesitation she quickly buried beneath professionalism. "Thank you, ma'am," she said, her tone firmer now, projecting confidence for the audience that had quietly formed around them. A man in a navy suit leaned slightly into the aisle, pretending to adjust his cufflinks while watching closely across from him. A woman paused mid-scroll on her phone, her screen dimming as her attention shifted fully to the unfolding scene. The cabin crew near the galley exchanged quick glances, subtle but meaningful, the kind that signaled something was no longer routine. Lydia gestured toward the front of the cabin. "If you would just come with me for a moment, we can sort this out before departure," she said. Evelyn nodded once, neither resisting nor complying too eagerly, simply acknowledging the request with quiet dignity. As she took a step forward, the soft carpet absorbed the sound, but the tension followed her like an invisible thread, pulling every gaze in the cabin along with her. Each step felt measured, deliberate, as if time itself had slowed to watch what would happen next. At the front of the cabin, just behind the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the aircraft, Lydia stopped and turned, lowering her voice slightly, though not enough to escape notice from those nearby. "There appears to be a discrepancy with your seating assignment," she said, holding the boarding pass again but not offering it back. "Seat 2A is part of a restricted allocation, typically reserved for our highest-tier passengers or those with executive clearance." Evelyn's eyes moved briefly to the boarding pass, then back to Lydia. "I was not aware that a confirmed ticket required further qualification," she replied softly. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was a precision in her words that carried weight. Lydia's jaw tightened just enough to be seen. "I am simply following protocol, ma'am," she said, her smile returning, but thinner now, less certain. "If there has been an error, we will need to relocate you to ensure compliance with our policies." The word relocate hung in the air, dressed in politeness, but unmistakably final behind them. The low murmur of the cabin had faded into near silence. Even those not directly watching could feel it, the shift in atmosphere, the subtle discomfort of witnessing something that felt slightly off, slightly unfair. A young flight attendant stood near the galley, her hands clasped together, her eyes darting between Lydia and Evelyn, as if searching for a cue on how to respond. Evelyn glanced past Lydia for a brief moment, her gaze sweeping the cabin not with embarrassment, but with quiet awareness. She saw the watching eyes, the curiosity, the judgment, and the uncertainty, and yet none of it seemed to touch her. When she spoke again, her voice remained steady. "I have a boarding pass that was issued, scanned, and accepted," she said. "I followed the process exactly as required." Lydia exhaled slowly, the patience in her expression thinning with each passing second. "And I am telling you that something about that process may need to be reviewed," she replied, her tone now carrying a sharper edge. "I am going to ask you one more time to step aside, so we can reseat you appropriately." The finality in her words drew a deeper silence from the surrounding space. It was no longer just a routine check. It had become a quiet standoff, one based not on facts, but on perception, on who looked like they belonged, and who did not. Evelyn's fingers closed gently around the handle of her carry-on, still resting just a few feet away in the overhead compartment. She did not move toward it. Instead, she remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, her eyes steady on Lydia. There was no defiance in her stance, no raised voice, no visible frustration, only a stillness that seemed to absorb the tension rather than reflect it. For a brief moment, Lydia hesitated again. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, the kind of hesitation that comes when certainty begins to crack, but the presence of watching eyes pushed her forward, reinforcing the role she had already committed to. "I will have to involve the cabin supervisor if this continues," she said, her voice now louder, carrying just enough to reach the nearest rows. Evelyn inclined her head slightly, as if acknowledging a reasonable next step. "That would be appropriate," she said, and just like that, the line had been drawn, not with anger, not with resistance, but with something far more unsettling for those who relied on control to maintain order. The quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly where they stood, even if no one else did. And somewhere in the cockpit, A routine pre-flight check was being completed, unaware that the real disruption was not mechanical, but human, unfolding just a few rows behind, where perception and reality were about to collide in a way no one in that cabin was prepared for. The moment Lydia mentioned the cabin supervisor, the atmosphere shifted again, tightening in a way that made even the most composed passengers sit a little straighter, as if instinctively preparing for something they could not yet define. Evelyn Carter did not move from where she stood, her presence calm yet unyielding, like a quiet center in a room that had begun to spin around her. Lydia turned sharply, signaling to a colleague near the galley. With a subtle but urgent nod, within seconds, a taller figure emerged from behind the curtain, his uniform immaculate, his expression trained into the neutral authority of someone accustomed to resolving conflicts quickly and quietly. Mark Reynolds, the cabin supervisor, carried himself with the confidence of experience, but as his eyes moved from Lydia to Evelyn, there was a flicker of calculation, the kind that comes from assessing not just a situation, but the people within it. Lydia stepped closer to him, lowering her voice. Though fragments still carried through the tense silence, there seems to be an issue with seat 2A, she said. The assignment does not align with our priority allocation. Mark nodded once, then turned his attention fully to Evelyn. Ma'am. Good morning, he began, his tone measured, respectful, but firm. I understand there may be some confusion regarding your seat. Evelyn met his gaze without hesitation. There is no confusion on my end, she replied. My boarding pass was issued and verified. Mark extended his hand slightly. May I take a look at it? Evelyn handed it over, her movements smooth, unhurried. Mark studied the pass carefully, his brow furrowing just slightly as he read the details, then scanned it again with a handheld device. A soft confirmation tone sounded clear and undeniable. Seat 2A, boarding group 1. No flags, no notes, no irregularities. The device did not lie, yet something in the unspoken rules of the cabin seemed to resist that reality. Mark glanced briefly at Lydia, whose posture had stiffened, her confidence now resting on expectation rather than certainty. There must be a system misallocation, he said slowly, choosing his words with care. This seat is typically reserved under executive discretion. Evelyn's expression did not change. Typically, she repeated softly, but not exclusively. Mark exhaled through his nose, a subtle sign of tension building beneath his composed exterior. Around them, the silence deepened further. Passengers were no longer pretending not to watch. A man across the aisle leaned forward, fully now, elbows resting on his knees, his curiosity no longer concealed. A woman near the window removed her headphones entirely, holding them in her lap as she listened. The cabin had become an audience, and every word carried weight. Mark adjusted his stance, shifting from explanation to resolution. Ma'am, I am going to ask you to temporarily step out of first class while we verify this with operations. He said it should only take a few minutes. The request was polite on the surface, but its implication was clear. You do not belong here. Not yet. Not until we decide. Evelyn's fingers brushed lightly against the fabric of her sweater, a small, almost imperceptible movement that seemed to ground her before she spoke again. And if I decline, she asked quietly. The question landed with more force than any raised voice. Lydia's eyes narrowed slightly, while Mark paused, clearly not expecting resistance framed so calmly that would complicate the boarding process. He replied, his tone tightening, just enough to signal a shift from request to expectation. We are on a schedule. Evelyn gave a small nod, as if acknowledging the logic without accepting the premise. Schedules are important, she said, but so is accuracy. Another silence followed, heavier this time, stretching longer than before. It was no longer just tension. It was a test not of rules, but of authority, of who would yield first. Mark's grip on the boarding pass tightened slightly before he handed it back. I assure you, we will resolve this quickly, he said, but for now, I need your cooperation. Evelyn took the pass, her fingers steady, her gaze unwavering. You have it, she said. I am standing right here. The simplicity of her response left no room for misinterpretation. She was not refusing outright, but she was not moving either. It was a boundary drawn without aggression, a quiet line that could not be easily crossed without consequence. Lydia shifted her weight, clearly growing impatient with the stalemate. This is unnecessary, she said, her voice sharper now. We are simply trying to maintain standards. The word standards lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Evelyn's eyes moved to her briefly, not with anger, but with a kind of clarity that made Lydia look away for just a fraction of a second. In that moment, Something subtle but undeniable changed. The confidence that had fueled the confrontation began to fracture, replaced by uncertainty that no one wanted to acknowledge. And somewhere beyond the cabin, a signal moved through unseen systems, unnoticed by those standing in that narrow aisle. A quiet chain reaction already in motion, one that would soon arrive with a clarity none of them could ignore. And when it did, the question would no longer be whether Evelyn belonged in seat 2A, but whether anyone in that cabin truly understood what belonging meant at all. The word standards did not fade when Lydia said it. It settled into the cabin like a quiet accusation, shaping how every eye now saw the woman standing in the aisle. Evelyn Carter did not respond immediately, and that silence became its own answer, calm, controlled, and impossible to rush. Mark Reynolds shifted his stance again, the balance of authority beginning to feel less stable than it had moments ago, as if the situation had slipped beyond the boundaries of routine procedure and into something far more delicate. Behind him, the curtain to the galley moved slightly as another crew member stepped closer, drawn in by the tension that now filled the front of the aircraft like a pressure that could not be ignored. Lydia crossed her arms briefly before catching herself, lowering them again as she forced a professional posture. Though the edge in her expression had sharpened, she was no longer simply enforcing a policy. She was defending a judgment she had already made, and that difference was beginning to show. Ma'am, Mark said carefully, choosing each word with precision, we are trying to resolve this with minimal disruption. Evelyn inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without conceding anything. I understand that, she replied, and I am giving you the same consideration. Her voice remained soft, but it carried clearly through the stillness, each word measured, deliberate, leaving no room for dismissal. A faint chime sounded from deeper within the aircraft, signaling another stage of pre-departure checks. But no one at the front of the cabin moved to respond to it. The focus remained locked on the quiet standoff unfolding just a few feet from the first row seats. Lydia exhaled slowly, her patience now visibly thinning. This is not about consideration, she said, her voice tighter than before. It is about maintaining the integrity of this cabin. The phrase hung in the air, heavier than she intended, drawing a subtle shift in the expressions of those listening. A man near the aisle frowned slightly, as if questioning something he could not quite articulate. Evelyn's gaze met Lydia's again. Steady and unwavering integrity is important, she said quietly. That is why accuracy matters. The simplicity of her response landed harder than any confrontation. And for a brief moment Lydia had no immediate reply. Mark stepped in before the silence stretched too far, his tone firmer now, attempting to reassert control. We are contacting operations to verify the allocation of this seat, he said. Until we receive confirmation, we need to proceed with standard protocol. Evelyn did not move. Standard protocol should not override confirmed information, she said. Her eyes flicked briefly to the handheld device still in Mark's hand, the same device that had already validated her seat. Without hesitation, that detail did not go unnoticed. A subtle ripple of awareness moved through the nearby passengers, as if the invisible balance of the situation had shifted slightly in Evelyn's favor. Lydia noticed it too, and it unsettled her more than she expected. She stepped forward again, closing the distance just enough to reclaim presence. Ma'am, she said, her voice lower but sharper now. If you do not comply, we will have to escalate this further. The word escalate lingered, carrying implications that no one said out loud, but everyone understood. Evelyn's expression remained unchanged. There was no fear in her eyes, no irritation, only a quiet certainty that seemed to exist independently of the situation around her. Then perhaps that is what needs to happen, she replied. The words were calm, almost gentle, but they landed with unmistakable finality. For a second, no one spoke. The cabin, already silent, seemed to press even deeper into stillness. The hum of the aircraft systems became more noticeable, a low, constant sound beneath the tension, as if the plane itself was waiting. Lydia's composure faltered just slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face before she masked it again. Mark glanced toward the cockpit door, then back at Evelyn, clearly weighing his next move carefully. This was no longer a simple matter of procedure, it had become a question of judgment, and every second that passed made that judgment more visible to everyone watching. Then, without warning, a soft click sounded overhead. The cabin intercom activated with a brief tone that cut cleanly Through the silence, every head turned instinctively toward the source. The voice that followed was calm, controlled, and unmistakably authoritative, carrying the kind of weight that did not need to raise volume to command attention. "This is the captain speaking." There was a brief pause, just long enough to draw every ounce of focus in the cabin into that single moment before we finalized boarding. "I need confirmation on a passenger in seat 2. Mark froze mid-breath. Lydia's posture stiffened. The air itself seemed to tighten as the words settled in, and in that instant, the situation shifted from a quiet dispute in the aisle to something far larger, something that was no longer contained within the judgment of a single crew member or even a single cabin, because whatever came next would not just clarify a seat assignment, it would reveal exactly who had been right all along. The captain's voice did not need to repeat itself, because the impact of that single sentence had already settled into every corner of the cabin. Like a sudden drop in air pressure, Mark Reynolds stood completely still, the handheld device now lowered slightly in his grip, as if it had lost its authority in the presence of something far greater. Lydia Grant felt the shift instantly, though she could not yet explain it, a quiet unease creeping into the confidence she had been holding onto so tightly. Evelyn Carter remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if the moment unfolding around her had always been inevitable. The intercom clicked softly again, and the captain continued, his tone measured but now carrying a sharper edge. "I am receiving a priority flag tied directly to that seat assignment. I need immediate confirmation from the cabin crew." There was no confusion in his voice now, only expectation, the kind that did not tolerate delay. Mark's throat tightened slightly as he turned toward Lydia, his voice lower than before, no longer projecting but searching. "Lydia, did you flag this seat?" She hesitated for the first time, a real hesitation, not the brief flickers from before, but something deeper, something that revealed uncertainty. I was verifying a discrepancy," she replied, though the words felt less solid as they left her mouth. Mark's eyes moved back to Evelyn, then to the boarding pass in his hand, then to the device that had already confirmed everything. Without hesitation, the pieces were no longer aligning with the assumption that had started this entire situation. The silence in the cabin deepened further, if that was even possible. Now every passenger was watching openly, no longer pretending to be occupied. Phones were lowered, conversations had stopped completely, and even the subtle movements of the crew had paused, as if the entire aircraft had been placed on hold. Then, from the intercom again, the captain spoke, but this time his voice carried something different, something unmistakable. "Confirm identity for passenger in seat 2. Evelyn Carter." Mark's head turned sharply toward Evelyn, the name landing with more weight than he expected. Lydia's breath caught just slightly, her composure beginning to fracture. "At the edges, yes. That is correct," Mark said into the nearest intercom receiver, his voice steady but quieter than before. There was a brief pause, just long enough to stretch the tension to its limit before the next words came through and confirmed that she has not been moved or reassigned. Another pause, this time longer, the kind that made every second feel deliberate. Mark glanced at Lydia again, and this time there was no attempt to mask the question in his eyes. "No, she has not been reassigned," he answered carefully. Then the captain spoke again, and when he did, the entire cabin seemed to lean into the sound. "Ensure that remains the case." His tone did not rise, but the authority behind it was absolute. "That seat is under direct executive designation." The words hit with quiet force, like a door closing with finality. Lydia felt it before she fully understood it, the meaning unfolding in her mind piece by piece, each one heavier than the last. Executive designation. Her gaze shifted slowly back to Evelyn, really seeing her now, not the sweater, not the simplicity, but the composure, the certainty, the complete absence of doubt that had been there from the beginning. Mark straightened slightly, the shift in his posture immediate and unmistakable. "Understood, Captain," he said. The intercom clicked off, and the silence that followed was no longer tense in the same way it had changed. It was no longer a question of what was happening, it was the beginning of realization. Mark turned fully toward Evelyn now, his expression no longer guarded but respectful in a way that could not be mistaken. "Ma'am, I apologize for the confusion," he said, his voice controlled but carrying a sincerity that had not been there before. "Your seat is confirmed. There will be no further interruptions." Lydia did not speak. She could not. Her earlier certainty had collapsed under the weight of what she now understood, but had not yet fully processed the standard she had tried to enforce had just been redefined in a way she could not challenge. Evelyn held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod. Acknowledging the apology without drawing attention to it, she turned calmly and walked back toward seat 2A, her steps just as measured as before, but now the space around her felt different. The same passengers who had watched with curiosity now watched with something else, something closer to recognition. As she reached her seat and sat down, fastening her seatbelt once more, no one spoke. The cabin had gone completely silent, not out of tension this time, but out of something deeper, a quiet understanding settling over everyone present. And as Lydia stood frozen near the aisle, the realization continued to unfold in her mind that this had never been about a seat or a policy or even a mistake. It had been about judgment, and in that moment, she knew with absolute clarity that she had judged completely wrong. The silence did not break when Evelyn Carter returned to her seat. It deepened, settling over the cabin with a weight that no one could ignore. The earlier tension had transformed into something quieter but far more powerful. A shared awareness that something important had just happened, something that could not be undone. Mark Reynolds stepped back slowly, giving space not just physically but symbolically. His authority now repositioned in response to a reality he had not initially recognized. His movements became more deliberate, more careful, as if every action now carried greater meaning. Lydia Grant, however, remained where she stood, her posture rigid, her mind still catching up to the shift that had taken place. The word executive echoed in her thoughts, repeating with a clarity that left no room for reinterpretation. It was not just a designation, it was a level of access, a layer of control that existed above the policies she had relied on for years, and she had challenged it openly. Her gaze moved toward Evelyn again, but this time it was different. There was no judgment in it now, no quick assessment based on appearance. Instead, there was something closer to realization, mixed with the quiet discomfort of understanding how quickly assumptions could lead to consequences. The other passengers began to move again, but slowly, cautiously, as if unsure whether it was appropriate to return to normal behavior. A man adjusted his jacket, but kept glancing toward seat 2. A woman resumed scrolling on her phone, though her eyes lifted every few seconds. The illusion of routine had been disrupted, and it would take time to rebuild. Lydia finally took a step back, then another, retreating toward the galley area where the rest of the crew stood waiting. Her movements were controlled, but the confidence that had once defined them had shifted into something more restrained. One of the younger attendants leaned slightly toward her, whispering something too soft to be heard, but Lydia did not respond. Immediately, she simply nodded once, her eyes still fixed forward as if replaying the moment in her mind. Meanwhile, Mark moved closer to Evelyn's seat, stopping just enough distance away to maintain professionalism while signaling respect. Ma'am, he said quietly, I want to personally ensure that the remainder of your flight is handled with the highest level of care. Evelyn looked up at him, her expression unchanged, calm, composed, untouched by the tension that had filled the cabin moments earlier. Thank you, she replied simply. There was no emphasis, no lingering tone, just acknowledgement. Mark hesitated for a brief moment, then added, if there is anything you need, anything at all, please let us know. The words were sincere, but they also carried an unspoken recognition of what had just occurred. Evelyn gave a small nod, then looked forward again, her attention already shifting away from the incident, as if it no longer required her focus. The simplicity of her response made it clear she had never been seeking validation or apology. She had only expected accuracy. Mark stepped away, returning to his position with a different posture than before, one shaped not by authority, but by awareness. Across the aisle, the man who had been watching from the beginning leaned back slowly in his seat, exhaling as if releasing a tension he had not realized he was holding. Another passenger glanced toward Evelyn, then quickly looked away, as though uncertain whether it was appropriate to acknowledge what had just happened. The cabin crew resumed their duties, but there was a noticeable change in their movements. Conversations were quieter, smiles were more careful, even the way drinks were offered carried a new level of attention, as if everyone had become more aware of the weight behind each interaction. Lydia remained near the galley, her hands now resting lightly against the counter as she stared at nothing in particular. Her thoughts moved quickly, piecing together fragments of information that now formed a clearer picture. Executive designation, not just a passenger, not just a priority, but someone directly connected to the highest level of the airline, and then, almost as if her mind resisted the conclusion before finally accepting it, another realization settled in someone at that level would not travel unnoticed unless they chose to, and that meant Evelyn had chosen this appearance, chosen simplicity, chosen to move through the world without signaling her status, and Lydia had mistaken that choice for limitation. The recognition did not come with a sudden shock, but with a slow, heavy clarity that settled deeper with each passing second. She had not just made a procedural error, she had revealed something about how she saw people, and that realization carried more weight than any reprimand ever could. At the front of the cabin, the door to the cockpit remained closed, but the presence behind it felt closer now, more connected to what had just unfolded, and though no further announcements were made, the message had already been delivered clearly enough, not through volume, not through confrontation, but through a quiet correction that had shifted everything without needing to say more. And as the aircraft prepared for departure, with systems checked and doors soon to close, one truth lingered in the stillness that followed that some lessons do not arrive with noise or spectacle, they arrive in silence, and they stay long after the moment has passed. The aircraft doors closed with a muted, final sound that seemed louder than usual, sealing not just the cabin, but the moment that had just unfolded inside it. The subtle shift from boarding to departure carried with it a sense of forward motion, yet the atmosphere remained marked by what had happened, as if the air itself still held the memory of it. Evelyn Carter sat quietly in seat 2A, her gaze forward, her posture relaxed, as though the entire incident had already faded into something insignificant. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, fingers still, her breathing even, untouched by the tension that had defined the last several minutes around her. The cabin slowly began to return to life, but not to what it had been before. Voices resumed, but softer laughter returned, but restrained. Even the clinking of glasses and the rustle of magazines carried a different tone, one shaped by awareness rather than routine. Lydia Grant remained near the galley, though her presence had changed in a way that could not be ignored. She moved now with a deliberate caution, each action measured, each glance more thoughtful than before. The certainty that had once guided her decisions had been replaced by something quieter, something that required her to think before she acted, to see before she judged. She reached for a tray, adjusting it carefully, though her focus was clearly elsewhere. Her mind continued to replay the moment in the aisle, the calm voice, the steady gaze, the way Evelyn had stood without raising her voice or losing composure. It unsettled her in a way she could not easily explain, because it had not been force that shifted the outcome. It had been certainty, the kind that did not need to prove itself. Mark Reynolds moved through the cabin with renewed attention, checking on passengers with a level of care that felt more intentional than routine. When he approached seat 2A again, it was not out of obligation, but out of respect. "Ma'am, we will be departing shortly," he said quietly. "If you need anything before takeoff, please let me know." Evelyn looked up briefly, offering a small nod. "Thank you. I am fine," she replied. Her voice remained calm, consistent, unchanged. Mark hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if considering whether to say more, then simply inclined his head and stepped away, understanding that nothing further was needed. Across the aisle, the man in the navy suit who had watched from the beginning leaned slightly toward Evelyn. "Excuse me," he said, his tone respectful but curious. "I just wanted to say." That was handled with a lot of grace. Evelyn turned her head slightly, acknowledging him with a polite expression. "Thank you," she said simply. There was no elaboration, no attempt to revisit what had happened, just a quiet acknowledgement that seemed to close the moment rather than extend it. The man nodded, leaning back into his seat, his curiosity satisfied but also humbled by the simplicity of her response. As the aircraft began to push back from the gate, the low rumble of movement vibrated gently through the cabin, signaling the transition from stillness to motion. Outside the windows, the runway lights stretched into long lines of white and amber, guiding the aircraft forward with steady precision. Inside, the cabin crew took their positions, their movements synchronized but subtly altered by the awareness they now carried. Lydia moved down the aisle once more, this time with a tray of pre-departure beverages. When she reached Evelyn's seat, she paused for just a fraction of a second before speaking. "Ma'am, would you care for something to drink before takeoff?" Her voice was different now, not just polite, but careful, respectful in a way that came from understanding rather than assumption. Evelyn looked up, Meeting her gaze for a brief moment, the two women stood in silence, the weight of their earlier interaction still present, but transformed water. "Please, Evelyn," said. Lydia nodded, her movements precise as she poured the drink and placed it gently on the tray table in front of her. "Thank you," she added quietly, the words simple but carrying more meaning. "Then their length," suggested. Evelyn gave a small nod in return, accepting the gesture without drawing attention to it. As Lydia moved on, her steps remained steady, but something in her posture had shifted permanently. The lesson had settled, not as a moment of embarrassment, but as a quiet correction that would stay with her long after the flight ended. The aircraft turned toward the runway, engines building gradually, the sound deepening as the plane prepared for takeoff. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, and the final announcements began, guiding passengers through the familiar routine. Yet beneath that routine, something had changed, not in the systems or the procedures, but in the way people saw each other. And as the plane accelerated, lifting from the ground into the open sky, one truth remained clear in the quiet that followed: that respect is not determined by appearance, and the moment you assume it is, you risk misunderstanding everything that truly matters. At 30,000 feet, the world outside the aircraft had dissolved into a soft expanse of white clouds and pale blue sky, a quiet contrast to the tension that had once filled the cabin. Just minutes before, the seatbelt sign dimmed with a gentle chime, and movement slowly returned as passengers adjusted their positions, reached for drinks, and resumed conversations that felt slightly more thoughtful than before. Evelyn Carter remained still in seat 2A, her gaze resting on the horizon beyond the window, as if the events on the ground had already been placed behind her, filed away without weight or resentment. There was something about her stillness that drew attention without asking for it, a quiet gravity that made people notice even when they tried not to. Across the aisle, the man in the navy suit glanced at her again, then quickly looked away, as though unsure whether it was appropriate to continue observing someone who clearly did not seek recognition. In the galley, Lydia Grant stood with her back partially turned, organizing items that did not need organizing, her hands moving through familiar motions while her mind remained elsewhere. The moment in the aisle replayed again, not in fragments now, but as a complete picture, one she could not reinterpret or justify. She had seen a person and decided what that person represented before understanding anything real about them, and the cost of that decision had been revealed not through punishment, but through clarity. That was what unsettled her most. There had been no raised voice, no confrontation, no demand for apology, only a quiet correction that had left no space for defense. She reached for a stack of napkins, aligning them carefully, then stopping as she realized she had already done that twice before. The small detail pulled her back into the present, grounding her just enough to notice something she had not considered earlier. Evelyn had never once tried to prove who she was. She had not mentioned a title, a connection, or a status. She had simply remained certain, allowing the truth to reveal itself when it needed to. That realization settled deeper than anything else, because it meant the power in that moment had not come from wealth or influence alone. It had come from restraint and confidence. Mark Reynolds moved quietly through the aisle again, checking seatbelts, offering assistance, maintaining the rhythm of the flight, but his awareness remained sharper than before. When he reached the front of the cabin, he paused briefly near Lydia. His voice was low, almost private. "Let it settle," he said simply. Lydia nodded once, not trusting herself to respond more than that. She understood what he meant. This was not a moment to fix or undo, it was a moment to absorb. As the flight leveled out, the service resumed in full, trays prepared, drinks refreshed, the familiar patterns of first class returning with practiced precision. Yet even within that routine, something had shifted. Passengers responded differently, offering quieter thank yous, holding eye contact just a second longer, as if each interaction now carried more meaning than before. When Lydia approached seat 2A again, this time with a meal tray, her movements were steady, but her awareness was heightened in a way that could not be ignored. "Ma'am, your meal," she said, placing it gently on the tray table in front of Evelyn. Her voice was calm, respectful, but no longer guarded. Evelyn looked up, meeting her gaze with the same quiet composure. "Thank you." Lydia hesitated for a fraction of a second, then added, "If there is anything you need, please let me know." The words were simple, but they carried sincerity now, free from assumption or judgment. Evelyn gave a small nod, accepting the gesture without extending the moment further. As Lydia moved away, she felt. The shift settled more completely within her, not as discomfort, but as understanding, the kind that does not fade quickly because it changes how you see every interaction that follows. The cabin moved forward, time passing in quiet increments measured by the soft hum of engines and the steady rhythm of flight outside. The clouds drifted endlessly, unchanged by what had happened inside, indifferent to human perception, yet inside something had been altered in a way that would last far beyond this journey. And as Evelyn sat quietly, untouched by the need to explain or assert, one truth became impossible to ignore for those who had witnessed it: that real power does not announce itself, it does not argue for recognition, it simply exists, steady and undeniable, waiting for others to realize what they failed to see from the very beginning. By the time the aircraft began its gradual descent, the cabin had settled into a quiet rhythm that felt almost untouched by the earlier tension, yet something intangible remained beneath the surface, a subtle awareness that had not faded with altitude. Evelyn Carter sat as she had for most of the flight, composed, her attention drifting between the passing clouds and the stillness within herself, as if the entire experience had simply confirmed something she already understood rather than changed anything within her. The announcement for initial descent came through the intercom, calm and routine, but for those who had witnessed the moment on the ground, it carried a different weight, signaling not just the end of a flight, but the closing of an unspoken lesson. Lydia Grant stood once more in the galley, preparing for landing procedures, her movements now precise in a different way, guided not just by training, but by reflection. Each action felt more intentional, each interaction more considered, as though the simple act of serving had taken on a deeper meaning. She glanced down the aisle, her eyes briefly resting on seat 2A before she looked away again, not out of avoidance, but out of respect. The realization that had settled in her earlier had not left, it had grown clearer with time, reshaping how she saw the passengers around her, not as categories, not as assumptions, but as individuals whose stories she did not know and had no right to define. Mark Reynolds moved through the cabin one final time, ensuring everything was secure, his presence steady, but quieter than before. When he reached Evelyn's seat, he paused. Just briefly, ma'am. We will be landing shortly, he said, his tone respectful. Thank you for your patience earlier. Evelyn looked up, offering a small, acknowledging nod. There was no need to revisit the moment in detail, no need to extend it beyond what it had already revealed. You are welcome, she replied simply. The exchange was brief, but complete. As the aircraft descended through the clouds, the city below came into view, buildings stretching outward, roads threading through the landscape, a reminder that life continued beyond the controlled environment of the cabin. Yet for those inside, something had shifted in a way that would not disappear as easily as the clouds outside. The wheels touched down with a smooth, controlled motion, a gentle return to ground that mirrored the quiet resolution of what had taken place. Taxiing to the gate, the cabin remained calm, but there was a different kind of energy now, one shaped by reflection rather than routine. When the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers began to gather their belongings, movements measured, conversations subdued. The man in the navy suit stood, retrieving his bag, then paused for a moment, glancing toward Evelyn before offering a small nod of acknowledgement, a silent gesture that carried more respect than words could have conveyed. Evelyn returned the nod briefly, then stood, reaching for her carry-on with the same calm efficiency she had shown from the beginning. No urgency, no display, just quiet presence. Lydia remained near the exit door, her posture straight, her expression composed, but her eyes more aware than they had been at the start of the journey. As passengers began to disembark, she greeted each one with a polite smile, but there was a noticeable difference in how she looked at them now. When Evelyn approached, the moment slowed almost imperceptibly. Lydia met her gaze directly this time, without hesitation or assumption. Thank you for flying with us, ma'am, she said, her voice steady but carrying a sincerity that had not been there before. Evelyn paused for just a fraction of a second. Meeting her eyes, there was no trace of resentment in her expression, no indication that she carried the earlier moment with her, only the same calm certainty that had defined her from the beginning. Thank you, she replied softly. Then, with no further words, she stepped past and continued toward the open door, sunlight spilling into the cabin. As she exited into the jet bridge, Lydia watched her go for a brief moment before turning back to the remaining passengers. But something in her had changed in a way she could not ignore. The lesson had not been delivered through reprimand or consequence. It had been revealed through contrast, through the quiet strength of someone who did not need to prove anything to be understood. And as the final passengers left the aircraft and the cabin began to empty, one truth lingered in the stillness that followed: that respect is not something you grant based on what you see. It is something you owe before you decide what someone is worth. And that day, without raising her voice, without demanding recognition, Evelyn Carter had reminded everyone on that flight exactly what dignity looks like.